I would like to welcome the colleagues and say good morning to colleagues of the RCN, colleagues of the donors of the GF, representatives of different organizations, including some of the media, and all of you, ladies and gentlemen. I am very pleased actually to be here today to be able to take part in the report launch of the Democracy Resource Center Nepal, the report on the local level elections that, as we all know, were successfully held in 3 phases from May through to September. These local level elections were absolutely historic, and as we know, they were held after nearly 2 decades under the new constitution promulgated in 2015. I would like to take this opportunity, even though the Election Commission is not here, to congratulate the Election Commission of Nepal for playing a key role in actually successfully conducting these local elections despite the political and logistical challenges that came with it. Organizing elections is key in a post-conflict transition. Elections are a major step to legitimize the laws and policies of the state, and they are key to building a representative and vibrant democracy. However, it's also equally key to ensure that elections give equal opportunity to all eligible citizens to exercise their fundamental rights. While it was important to hold the elections on the date set by the government, it was equally important in our view to monitor the elections to ensure its legitimacy and political integrity. The importance of election monitoring at this point in history, I think, hardly needs any emphasis. I think it's clear to all of us why the election observation is so important. Monitoring helps to provide an impartial, neutral assessment of the quality of the entire electoral process. And this is possible only through long-term observation rather than limiting monitoring to the activities on the polling day itself. And this is why the governance facility, which I am heading, decided to provide technical and financial support to the Democracy Resource Center to observe the entire electoral process context of the local level elections. The objective for us and for DRC and for anyone who is reading the report was to get a more in-depth and nuanced analysis of the electoral process, and by doing so eventually contribute to strengthening such processes in the future. And we are very pleased that after all the work done, we now have the comprehensive election observation report, which will be presented by Sudeep, I presume, in a short while. I would like to extend my absolute sincere appreciation to Sudeep Pukarel and his DRC team, which went many sleepless nights to actually, during the election observation and then to prepare the report that you all have in front of you that looks very fancy, that is very fancy, but I know that they actually had many sleepless nights and stressful days and getting it to the point of where it will be published. It's a major undertaking, and I really congratulate them for this. We also strongly believe that the findings and the recommendations that have been incorporated in this report will be useful in the discussions on electoral reform in the months ahead. And we hope that the findings will be helpful to other election observation groups that may be here, whether it's Carter Center or the EU or NIAC or GEOC. I'm also pleased to acknowledge the collaboration and support of our donor partners, the embassies of Denmark, Switzerland and DFID, which are the 3 contributors to the governance facility. We all know that now the provincial and the parliamentary elections are the next in line for in the months to come, and I'm very happy to share that the governance facility will continue to cooperate with DRC on long-term observation of provincial and parliamentary elections. Additionally, we are also providing support to the Carter Center as international observers. And we are expecting both the RCN and Carter Center to provide politically neutral, sound and in-depth analysis of the process. And we hope that this will help all of us seeing the bigger picture of what is going on and again contribute the reform as it may be needed. Despite rumors and articles to the contrary, the position of the governance facility and its donors is clear in that we believe that successfully conducting the provincial and parliamentary elections is another important and crucial step to implement the constitution and contribute constructively to Nepal's federal restructuring process and political transition. And I would like to take this opportunity to reiterate that the governance facility and its donors are deeply committed to Nepal's efforts to consolidate a vibrant and representative democracy and strengthen its governance structures and practices in the changed context of federal restructuring. The ultimate objective should be to equally serve the legitimate needs and aspirations of all, regardless of where people live. Once again, I would like to congratulate Sudeep and his team and extend good wishes for the observation of the upcoming elections and of course for the elections itself. Thank you all for taking out some time to come and look at this report presentation.
Dear ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for coming. I would start with the presentation right away. Democracy Resource Center would like to congratulate the people of Nepal for electing local representatives in the recent local elections and laud their enthusiasm that was reflected in a high voter turnout. We would also wish to express our appreciation to the Election Commission for conducting these elections despite significant challenges. This is a commendable accomplishment in a less than ideal situation. The government of Nepal, political parties, civil society, the media, domestic observer groups, and international community played an important role in assisting the Election Commission during these elections. Democracy Resource Center Nepal conducted observation of all three phases and reported on the pre-election day, election day, and post-election environment, including the political and security situation. These elections were conducted in divided and politically challenging circumstances. The promulgation of the Constitution in September 2015 was followed by violent protests in the Tarai Maldives region, leading to over 50 deaths. Although the protests had stopped, the demand for a more inclusive constitution and revision of the provincial boundaries remained when the local elections for May 14 were announced on February 20. The killings of 6 Madhesi protesters by police in Saptari in early March further intensified the situation. The delays in the local level restructuring process also posed major challenges in holding the elections. DRCN had conducted research on the restructuring of the local units process as well, and found that the process was rushed and there was widespread dissatisfaction, mostly related to the boundaries of local units and their centers. I would encourage you to visit the DRCN website and go through this local restructuring report as well. The entire election process was rushed again, including the legislation of important electoral laws. The Election Commission has regularly maintained that essential election laws need to be passed at least 120 days before the election date. This, according to the Commission, allows them to make adequate technical and logistical preparations. However, laws related to local elections were not passed until mid-December last year. The Election Commission also had to issue various last-minute directives and orders regarding important electoral processes like counting, for example. I would like to now highlight on the major findings of the report, divided into pre-election, election day, and post-election phases. I would like to reiterate that this was a rushed election. This was a rushed process, and due to this, preparations for important aspects of the electoral processes were compromised. For example, voter education was not effective and did not reach all voters. The number of volunteers deployed for voter education was inadequate and did not receive, and the educators did not receive required trainings and orientation. Although one voter educator was assigned to one polling location, in remote parts of the country, voters mentioned that they had not even seen or met them. Voter educators also did not reach some accessible urban centers in the Tarai. Voter education materials were also not adequately available in local languages, as mentioned to DRCN observers in Rautahar, Bardia, and Solbugul. Political parties conducted their own voter education mainly as part of their campaigning activities, but such education were mainly focused on encouraging voters to vote for them, for the political parties. There were common concerns raised about high vote invalidation as a result of poor voter education, and especially given the complicated ballot. I will talk more on the vote invalidation in the post-election section. The election dates were announced abruptly upon which the voter registration process was closed. This is and was a legal requirement. Voters and political parties across the country complained that this was not properly communicated to them and demanded that there be a window for more voters to register. People who voted in the last Constituent Assembly elections in 2013 believed that they did not need to register again. This excluded a lot of voters from the voters list due to lack of information. Technical errors in the voter register were also commonly reported. These errors included missing names, misspelling of names, mismatching photographs, and personal details. We have a case study in the report on inaccurate voter register from Mustang, which I encourage you to take a look at. Other issues in the pre-election phase included chaotic candidate nomination process, common breaches of the codes of conduct, especially related to excessive campaign expenses, and a very short duration of the official campaign period for some small parties and independent candidates. Unlike big parties with their fixed election symbols, independents and parties not represented in the parliament had to wait for their symbols until the conclusion of candidate nomination. Some independent candidates mentioned that they had just over a week for campaigning with their own symbols. As we all know, voters turned out in impressive numbers in all three phases of local elections, with an average turnout of over 74%. Election day was largely normal in all three phases, with some notable exceptions regarding procedural inconsistencies and some significant security incidents. In all three phases, there were commonly reported inconsistencies in following the election day processes. DRCN noted that adequate staffs were not deployed in many locations, especially during the third phase in Province 2. Not only were there insufficient staff deployed, but they also lacked proper trainings, leading to inconsistency in following polling protocols and creating confusion and chaos among voters and the officials themselves. The issue of proxy voting was almost always creating confusion, even among polling officials. Polling officers and voters were not sure if proxy voting was allowed, and if it was allowed, who was eligible to cast proxy votes. DRCN observed election officials and security personnel casting proxy votes or accompanying voters to assist them. Voter privacy was also observed to have been compromised in many locations, with officials, security guards, and other voters being easily able to see voters casting ballots. The election day of the first phase was characterized by major inter-party clashes, mainly in Dolakha district, where one person was killed in police firing. In Melum, Dolakha, police fired on party members allegedly attempting to conduct booth capture, resulting in one death. For those who are not familiar with the term booth capture, it usually indicates the act of stuffing ballots. As I had mentioned initially, there was also widespread dissatisfaction regarding restructuring of local units. One major impact of it was seen in Tingla village of Solukhumbu district, where an entire 2,476 registered voters boycotted polling. The community has been protesting since the results of the restructuring became public. We have a case study with a picture of an empty polling location on page 24. Please have a look. A quick mention, similar protest was also reported in Ujwa of Nawalparasi district, where only 2 out of over 500 voters turned out to vote. Moving on to the post-election findings, one of the most challenging processes during all three phases was the counting. It was time-consuming and cumbersome. The ballot was complicated and of low quality. There were insufficient counting officials, often lacking clarity on the counting guidelines. The political party representatives frequently disagreed on the agreed-upon guidelines and about invalid votes, which made the counting in some locations last for weeks. We all know the famous Bharatpur ghost, the details of which you can find as a case study in the report. But the fear of the Bharatpur ghost had some positive impact, with security enhanced during the third phase and physical barriers set up between the party agents and counting officials. Again, there is a picture of how it was done in page 27, which you can take a look. A successful election cannot be determined by the voter turnout numbers alone. Details of vote invalidation are essential to establish if people's participation in the election was meaningful. DRCN observation has regularly maintained that there was a potential for high vote invalidation because of the complicated ballot and ineffective voter education. Detailed vote invalidation data is not public. However, DRCN has seen results for some local units and they show very high invalidation rates, especially in some individual races. In Nawalparasi, complete invalidation in Pratappur rural municipality was 10.3%, but some individual races had invalidation rates up to almost 70%. In the race for Dalit women in Ward 8, only 479 of 1,596 votes were valid. In the limited post-election observation that the DRCN conducted, elections for local executives had concluded. However, many elected representatives expressed lack of awareness regarding their rights and responsibilities. This was mainly due to a delay in the passing of the Local Self-Governance Act. Moving on to the security and violence. Security deployment was high in general in all three phases, but significantly higher in places categorized as very sensitive. Nepal Army was more visible during the third phase in Province 2. Observers did not see Army patrolling during the first phase. It was seen in some districts like Nawalparasi and Morang in the second phase, and in all 8 districts of Province 2 during the third phase. Also notable was the absence of unarmed temporary police, commonly known as Myadis, in the third phase. Observers could not determine if this led to voter intimidation, but some interlocutors, including election officials, expressed their preference for unarmed security personnel. Unfortunately, most security-related incidents were caused by inter-party clashes, involving major political parties like Nepali Congress, UML, and Maoists. Contrary to the popular speculation, especially in Kathmandu, security-related incidents in the third phase covering Province 2, or we might call it Madhes Province, were significantly less compared to phases 1 and 2. A total of 11 incidents were recorded during the silence period and on election day in phase 3. A total of 11 incidents in phase 3 compared to 66 and 85 in phases 1 and 2. This surprised a lot of people, especially members of our political violence monitoring team, who have been tracking election-related incidents. Last but not the least, on the question of women and minority participation, the inclusion was limited to mandatory numbers and positions. Although overall participation of women in general was high, it is problematic that and underwhelming if you see the number of elected women in influential positions, like local unit chiefs or ward chairs. Only 2% out of 753 elected local unit chiefs were women. Despite all the challenges and issues I just mentioned in my presentation, the DRCN considers the conclusion of the local elections to be an important step forward in Nepal's political transition. However, we hope that these findings will help all of us learn important lessons and ensure that future elections, including the upcoming provincial and parliamentary elections, are improved. And that the elections are not limited to a formality or a routine, but will contribute to and strengthen the overall democratic process. Based on our findings, we have come up with a set of recommendations, which I will read out. And these recommendations are based on actors. So, to the Election Commission of Nepal, provide election officials and other relevant stakeholders with timely and adequate training and orientation on democratic standards, legal processes, and electoral procedures related to the elections to ensure that these information are effectively communicated. Provide adequate and timely resources to election officers and officials to enable them to better prepare for elections. Arrange for more effective voter education by providing adequate training to voter educators, increasing their duration of deployment, making education materials accessible and available to them on time, and making resources available to them in local languages and dialects. Coordinate with relevant stakeholders and partners to make electoral processes, including voter registration and voter education, more effective and accessible to voters on time. Periodically update and properly maintain the voter register and verify it at the local level to avoid technical errors. Ensure swift counting by deploying sufficient number of well-trained officials who are also trained in conflict mitigation to prevent confusion and delays. Review the counting procedures to find ways that can best respect the will of the voters by ensuring adequate transparency and security of the process. Review the laws and codes of conduct relating to campaign financing to make it realistic and ensure its strict compliance. Make the data for vote invalidation public, including full and partial invalidation, as well as the invalidation percentage of individual vote races. Ensure observer access to all electoral processes and communicate the roles and responsibilities of observers to officials at the local level in accordance with the observers' policy. To the government of Nepal, ensure that all electoral laws are in place and that the requisite preparations by the Election Commission of Nepal are complete before announcing the election date. Consider the duration between the nominations date and the day of polling to ensure a sufficient time period for campaigning, keeping in mind the disadvantages faced by small parties and independent candidates. Create a political and electoral environment conducive to conducting an election in a single phase. Avoid breaking an election into multiple phases for political reasons. To the political parties, strictly follow and abide by the election codes of conduct. Instruct cadres to assure citizens their right to participate in peaceful elections by refraining from use of coercion and violence. To the security forces, exercise maximum restraint while providing security at the polling locations, especially in areas with history of protests and violence. Ensure adequate security, but not over-deployment of personnel that may lead to voter intimidation. We hope these recommendations will be useful for making future election processes better. Thank you for listening, and in the end, I would like to thank our observers, without whom this would not have been possible. And also I would like to thank my team at the DRCN. Thank you, Caroline and Governance Facility, for supporting the observation work, and the Election Commission for the accreditation. Thank you, and now we will open the floor for questions, comments, suggestions, both in English and Nepali.